A studio buried this story for decades, not because anyone broke the law and not because lives were ruined, but because what happened behind the camera during one particular night shoot was so humiliating that 20th Century Fox spent thousands of dollars trying to fix it and then quietly told the entire cast and crew to never mention it again. The moment came down to industrial lighting equipment, two of the most celebrated actors of the 1960s, and a sound so absurd that a full film crew lost all composure every single time it occurred. For 30 years, audiences watched that gazebo scene and assumed it had gone off effortlessly. Julie Andrews finally broke the silence on live television, and what she described changed the way people see one of the most beloved films in the history of cinema. Long before Hollywood touched this story, European cinema had already made it famous on its own terms. In 1956, German producer Wolfgang Liebeniner released Die Trapp Family, a low-budget adaptation of Maria von Trapp's memoir, and followed it with a sequel the next year. Post-war West Germany responded with enormous warmth, and both films became the biggest commercial success German cinema had seen, eventually reaching audiences across Europe and South America through pure word of mouth. American studio executives who screened the German versions mostly dismissed them as too sentimental and too foreign, and nothing happened until Tony Award-winning director Vincent Donahue sat through both films and recognized something genuine underneath the dated production style. His instinct was to push not for a film adaptation, but for a Broadway musical built around Mary Martin, the reigning star of American musical theater at the time, and that single suggestion started a chain of events that nobody on earth could have predicted. The deal that made everything possible had already gone terribly wrong. Maria von Trapp, with no agent and no legal representation, sold the rights to her life story to German filmmakers in the early 1950s for a one-time payment of $9,000, which adjusted for inflation amounts to roughly $104,000 today. She had unknowingly signed away more than she understood. When Hollywood came knocking later, Maria refused to let studios adapt pieces of her story selectively, insisting the full truth be told or nothing at all. And when Mary Martin and her husband Richard Halliday began pursuing the stage rights, Maria was completely unreachable, deep in Papua New Guinea doing missionary work with Father Franz Wasner, the family's longtime musical director, with no telephone and no real interest in entertainment. Their letters piled up at remote mission posts, and Maria tore most of them open and discarded them. Halliday eventually flew to San Francisco to meet her ship in person when she returned to the United States, handed her tickets to see Martin perform in Annie Get Your Gun, and waited. Maria attended, was genuinely moved by the performance, and gave a casual yes that triggered one of the biggest chains of events in the history of musical theater. Rodgers and Hammerstein entered under very specific conditions. The original concept involved mixing traditional Austrian folk songs with only a handful of new compositions, but Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein refused that arrangement entirely, telling the producers it was a complete original score or nothing. After finishing Flower Drum Song, the pair returned to the Von Trapp project and wrote everything from scratch, producing My Favorite Things, Do Re Mi, Edelweiss, and Climb Every Mountain, songs that audiences across the world still sing today. Opening night arrived November 16th, 1959 at the L'Enfantin Theater in Broadway, with Mary Martin and Theodore Bickel leading the cast, and a production budget of $400,000 backing them. Advance ticket sales climbed past $232 million before most of the public had attended a single performance, and Martin performed in nearly every one of the 1,443 shows during the run before the production closed in June of 1963. 20th Century Fox paid $1,250,000 for the film rights, an amount made more remarkable by the studio's fragile financial state after the Cleopatra disaster had gone $15 million over budget and left departments and careers in genuine ruin. A clause buried in the contract promised Rodgers and Hammerstein's estate 10% of profits beyond $12.5 million, and co-writer Howard Lindsay laughed out loud when he read the number, completely certain the film would never approach that threshold. His confidence did not survive contact with reality. Casting Maria followed a path no one inside the studio would have designed intentionally. Hollywood had already passed over Julie Andrews once, rejecting her for the film version of My Fair Lady despite the fact that she had carried the Broadway production for years, and giving the role to Audrey Hepburn instead, whose songs then required extensive vocal dubbing to meet the demands of the part. Director Robert Wise was similarly hesitant about Andrews until someone at Disney showed him an early, unfinished cut of Mary Poppins. Wise turned to the screenwriter mid-screening and told him to lock her in before anyone else could. Andrews accepted the role for a flat fee of $225,000 with no royalties and no portion of the box office attached. Mary Martin, to put that figure in perspective, had collected more than $8 million from her cut of the Broadway run. Fox simply did not believe Andrews warranted a back-end deal, and when she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Mary Poppins and used her acceptance speech to thank Jack Warner, the Hollywood executive who had rejected her for My Fair Lady, the moment landed with exactly the quiet precision the audience deserved. Christopher Plummer solved a casting problem that had exhausted the production team for weeks. Sean Connery, coming off the James Bond film series, turned the role of Captain Von Trapp down. Richard Burton passed. Even Bing Crosby's name circulated as a possibility. Plummer eventually agreed only after director Robert Wise flew to London to make the case in person, and even then Plummer came with conditions, demanding that the captain receive emotional depth, sharper writing, and a song that revealed his inner life. That negotiation produced Edelweiss, which most audiences assume is a traditional Austrian folk song, but which Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote specifically for the character. Plummer called the film The Sound of Mucus throughout the Salzburg shoot, drank heavily, and later admitted in his 2008 memoir that the emotional Edelweiss performance at the festival, the scene that still moves audiences to tears, was filmed while he was drunk. His voice in the film's more demanding vocal passages belonged to Bill Lee, a professional singer who had also recorded for Disney productions, and Plummer's frustration over that substitution never fully disappeared even as the film's reputation grew into something historic. Casting the Von Trapp children produced its own round of surprises. Mia Farrow auditioned 3 times for the role of Liesel and was turned down each time, with the casting team's notes describing her as sweet but without sufficient energy and unable to dance at the level the role required. The part went to Charmian Carr, who at 21 years old was playing 16 with a natural confidence and warm presence that read immediately on camera. For the role of Friedrich, a young Kurt Russell came in to audition alongside Patty Duke and Terry Garr, but 15-year-old Nicholas Hammond won the role with a calm intensity the director responded to strongly, and years later, Hammond became the first live-action Spider-Man on American television in 1977. The children cast in those final roles built connections that outlasted the film itself, staying close to one another and to both Andrews and Plummer for decades. Filming in Salzburg was planned for 6 weeks and consumed 11. 1964 turned out to be one of the wettest years on record in Austria, and more than 250 cast and crew members sat through rain delays that chewed through the original $8.2 million budget at an alarming pace, adding hotel costs, equipment repair bills, and rising daily wages to an already stretched production. Fox executives, still raw from the Cleopatra losses, watched the numbers climb with open anxiety. The helicopter footage for the famous opening meadow sequence, which looks effortless and joyful on screen, required the aircraft to pass just 20 feet above Julie Andrews repeatedly, and the rotor wash knocked her flat onto the grass at least 6 or 7 times per pass. She kept standing up, smoothing down her clothes, and spreading her arms again. During the lake scene where the Von Trapp children fall from the boat, 5-year-old Kim Karath, who played the youngest daughter Gretel, nearly drowned. The crew informed Andrews seconds before filming that the child could not swim, and the plan was for Andrews to reach the child immediately when the boat capsized. The boat tipped, and Andrews fell backward, away from Karath, who slipped under the water twice before another actor jumped in and pulled her out. Karath spent time recovering from swallowing lake water and developed a fear of swimming that stayed with her for years. The gazebo scene itself, still considered one of the most romantic sequences in the history of musical film, collapsed repeatedly from the first take. The massive carbon arc lights used to simulate moonlight produced a sound that Andrews described on television years later as a long, wet, flat raspberry. And every time Plummer leaned his face toward hers, the lights delivered that noise on cue without fail. The crew could not hold themselves together. 20 attempts produced nothing usable, and Wise scrapped the lighting plan entirely, placing both actors in front of the glowing windows of the gazebo and shooting in silhouette so that their faces and their laughter stayed mostly out of frame. The soft, dreamlike quality that made the scene iconic was not an artistic choice, but a practical workaround, and 20th Century Fox suppressed the story for decades afterward. Before Robert Wise came anywhere near the production, director William Wyler had been attached to the project and had even resigned from Fox's board to avoid a conflict of interest. But Wyler had doubts about the material from the start, felt no real connection to the Broadway musical, and his growing hearing loss made directing a musical increasingly difficult to manage. When producers offered him The Collector, adapted from the John Fowles novel, Wyler asked to be released from his contract. The official explanation given to the press was scheduling conflicts, and Wise stepped in during late 1963 to inherit both the opportunity and the chaos that came with it. The film opened in 1965, and by November of the following year had overtaken Gone with the Wind as the highest-grossing film in Hollywood history, earning $286 million at actual 1960s ticket prices, not adjusted figures. That number represented roughly 283 million individual admissions, close to 1 in every 12 people alive on Earth at the time buying a ticket for a film with no digital marketing, no streaming platform, and no social media amplification behind it. The Academy Awards followed with 5 wins, including Best Picture and Best Director for Robert Wise. Neither Julie Andrews nor Christopher Plummer received a single dollar beyond their original flat contracts. The studio that had nearly panicked over budget overruns watched the film become the most commercially successful thing in the history of cinema, and the 2 people most visible on screen went home exactly as wealthy as the day they first signed their names.